This is a very interesting reading this morning. And there's a story about a great saint from many centuries ago, Kabir. And one time a disciple came to him and said, Guruji, how do I reach God? How do I find the path to God? And Kabir said, a path implies distance. It makes me smile to think of a fish in water, athirst. So in other words, the fish is swimming in water. How can it possibly be thirsty? We are swimming in God. How can we possibly think that we need to reach Him when He is everywhere? Yogananda said basically the same thing when he gave us a definition of self-realization. And he said, self-realization is the knowing in all parts of body, mind, and soul that you are now in possession of the kingdom of God. You don't need to pray that it come to you. God's omnipresence is your omnipresence. All you need to do is improve your knowing. So, in other words, we have God. We couldn't not have God. We're made out of God. Dharmadas and I were very interested in recently, was it two cores of stars that crashed into each other? So these two you saw it on the news too. So these enormously powerful, full of energy cores of stars crashed into each other. And what happened? Suddenly, through the explosion, they put out into the universe gold and precious metals. And so we were looking at our bangles going, wait a minute, that's from an explosion of a star. And we are made of stardust. God is the ultimate in recycling. It all comes back. And we go on life after life after life. As one lady after a lecture said to her friend in Swami's presence, he had been talking about reincarnation, and she said, and guess what? We get to come back. Yes, we do. This world is like a garden. It's God's garden. And we're each a little soul plant that God is giving everything we need to us. If we're a shade plant, we're planted in the shade. If we're needing more sun, He's got us out in the sun. He's giving us exactly what we need to grow. And that's the point of this life. To grow in awareness, to grow in consciousness, to become awake. Little sleeping souls, life after life, grow and learn and passage through dim corridors of waking consciousness to emerge at last into perfect light, into perfect joy. That's from the Festival of Light. And that's the point. We are becoming more and more awake. And we find God, we reach the goal, even though that implies distance. Our minds don't know how else quite to say it. But we awaken in God, we awaken in Thy light, when we start to do what this little chant this morning said. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. That's God whispering to us. Listen to the song that God is singing in your own hearts. That song of the Om vibration through which everything came into manifestation. Listen to that Om. And God is saying, I will never forget you. I will never forsake you. I had an interesting traumatic experience many years ago. And I had to do something, and I was feeling very concerned because I wasn't feeling well. I didn't think I could do a good job. I was very worried about it. So worried that I called my parents up and I asked them to pray for me. And my little parents, in Ohio, this was the 1970s, I guess, and there they were on the phone saying, you just offer yourself to God. Give it all to God. Remember, God is the doer. I got off the phone. They're telling me the yogic teachings. How did they know that? I forgot about that. God is the doer. And then I remember sitting there waiting to do this, and I just, you're trying to be calm, you're trying to be centered, and you're like, ah. And I remember thinking humorously and praying, okay, God, here I am, your human sacrifice. And it happened, and I lived through it, and all was well, and God was there. But the interesting thing about it was that by not running away and not going, oh no, I couldn't possibly do that, forget it, but offering myself in that moment to God. Yes, the event came off fine, but right at the end of the event itself, I received an incredible blessing. And I wouldn't have gotten that if I hadn't gone through the test. So it's up to us to keep offering ourselves. Why offer God anything? Because He already has everything. He already knows everything. Why tell Him anything? Because He wants to hear it from us. He wants our hearts. In all of creation, there's only one thing that God doesn't have yet, and that's our complete love and trust. He's growing us in this garden of souls so that we can grow to that point where we love Him and trust Him completely. I'll just end with a little story about an angel. I love stories about angels. So this was happened in the late 1940s. Young girl, teenager, was out in the summertime swimming in a quarry with her friends. And she was an excellent swimmer. So, she felt fine about swimming in this rather dangerous place because the quarry was very deep. Nobody knew even how deep it was. And it had these little outcroppings that were hidden under the water. So it was, you could get hurt if you didn't pay attention. So she was out there in the middle of the lake with her friends, and they were clowning around. And one of the people pushed her, and she fell in the water. They were on an outcropping out in the middle of the lake. She fell in the water, and nobody paid much attention because they knew she was such a good swimmer. But she hit her head, and her whole life started passing before her, all of 16 years or whatever, but it was all passing before her. And as she went down for the first time, she saw on the shore a man in a black suit. And even in this dazed state of mind, with her life passing before her, she said, why is he wearing a black suit on the beach, in this hot weather? That's so strange. And she went down and she came up and she saw that the man had ripped off his coat and he was swimming towards her. And then she blacked out, and the next thing she knew, she was on the beach and her friends were all looking at her, looking down at her and, shaking her to see if she was okay. And she said, yeah, I'm fine, but where's the man in the black suit? Because I want to thank him. And they looked at each other, and I said, there's no man in a black suit. And she went around to all the other people on the beach, and she said, did you see the man in the black suit? He just saved my life. And I said, we haven't seen anybody like that. We would have noticed a man in a black suit. And through her life, she's 90 years old now, she knows that God came to her in that way. We have angels around us all the time, whether we see them or not. Trust in God, offer yourself to Him, and you will experience His protection and His grace. And I know that story's true because it was my mother.
Should I use the mic? Okay. This topic, the title of this topic, Why Offer God Anything When He Has Everything, reminds me of the eternal dilemma. What are you going to get your dad for Christmas? He's got everything, And the default setting is, well, let's buy him another tie, and he ends up with a drawer full of ties that he never wears or whatever. And of course, in the case of God, He really does have everything. It's the whole universe. It's made out of Him. But I also want to just echo what Nirmala was saying, that it's our own sense of self-offering into the process that is what brings us. If we look at ourselves as little plants in the garden of souls, as Nirmala was describing, or as little children growing up into higher consciousness, God is waiting for the time when we have grown to the point where we are able and willing of our own accord, with no pressure, with no persuasion coming from God's side, we're able and willing to offer ourselves completely. And no one can force that. No one can make any pressure around that. I remember someone asking Swamiji one time a question of a very personal nature, and he simply responded, I can't answer that for you. You have to decide that for yourself, because it involved that person's own willingness to go forward in life. And no one else, all the best advice in the world doesn't teach us how to be in a process of growing. We have to do that ourselves. We have to follow that line of development ourselves. I remember as a child, there was an initiative organized by my church to connect. We were in the suburbs of Chicago, and in the city of Chicago, of course, there are lots of bad neighborhoods and lower economic areas. And our church wanted to sort of bridge that gap. And so we were connecting with some children who grew up in the inner city in a very rough neighborhood. And we would spend a little bit of time with them. I don't recall that we ever spent the night down there with their families, but we at least spent some time down there and got to know them a little bit. And vice versa, they would come out and stay with us, and they would stay for a night or two. And there was a girl who would stay with my twin sister, and there was a boy. The girl was maybe a year or two older than we were, and the boy who would come and stay with me was maybe a year younger than I was. And I remember being surprised. We were comfortably well off growing up in my home. I mean, it was a decent sized home, not opulent by any means, and my dad would have cringed to think that we would dare to think ourselves wealthy. But in this inner city boy's eyes, we were. And, it was a big home to him, and it was a fancy neighborhood, even though we didn't think it was. But it was very different from the inner city. And the interesting thing to me, the surprising thing to me, was to look through his eyes, because the first time he came, the first thing he did was to start asking me what was I going to give him. And I had things. I mean, I wasn't, like I said, we weren't destitute. Friends of mine had BB guns and motorcycles. Mini bike was the term at the time. But they had things that I didn't have that I thought were pretty awesome. But I was not without. I mean, I had a bicycle and I had a scooter at the time. I was probably 8 years old or something. And I remember thinking long and hard about giving this boy the scooter that I used. It's similar to the scooters that kids use now. Very clunky by comparison, but at least similar in shape at any rate, and similar in function. Sort of like the precursor of a skateboard. And I used to zoom around the neighborhood on that thing. I did finally give it to him, and it was a hard choice to do it. Now, what was interesting, this is where I had to learn over time, and I'm reminded a little bit of the movie The Answer, which some of you I think have seen, and probably many of you have not. It'll come out in the spring here, and we'll show it either here in the church or we'll rent a theater in Sacramento. There's a scene in that movie where Swamiji, in a similar setting, he grew up in Romania as a young child. His family was well off, and in comparison to the village children who didn't even, and it's brought out in the movie, they didn't even have enough money to put glass in their windows. They had newspapers for windows. So, they were very poor by comparison. But he was friendly with this one boy, but he didn't know how to relate. They did not know how to relate to each other. And there's a scene in the movie where they sort of challenge him, and a group of boys kind of surround him and are kicking a soccer ball at him and kind of taunting him and making fun of him in a way. And Swamiji was very hurt by that. And what I realized from both of these situations is that we ourselves, in order to be happy, have to offer something into life. And there was a different lesson for Swamiji, but I'm thinking of that boy because I think all of us have been around people who we just know that when we go into their presence, they're going to hit us for something. In P.G. Wodehouse, the phrase is, he could see a touch coming. He's going to be touched for a $5 or a $10, And we have all, whether it's someone looking for money, which it might be a little unusual in this culture, or just someone sort of dragging on our energy, we're aware of that kind of personality, and we tend to avoid that a little bit, at least psychically. But now, place ourselves in the position of the person doing the touching or the grabbing or the tugging. Like in the reading, Swamiji's talking about, don't tug at God's sleeve, don't pester God like you have to, constantly yank at him and get his attention. It's more, if you do the comparison from being the person who's sort of doing that all the time to being someone who's genuinely interested, genuinely has a deep, genuine friendship, then there is this natural wish to connect. When you ask the question, in different cultures, this is different, the answer comes differently. If you ask someone here in America, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. Next, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine, good, all good. Well, if you do that in Germany, ask somebody, well, how are you? You're going to get the real story. Oh, well, my knee hurts, and, my dog is not doing really well, and I'm really sorry about that. And, oh, my God, this job, I can't believe this job. It just never ends. They're going to give you the whole spiel. You better be ready to listen to it, because if you ask, then they assume you mean it, and they're going to really tell it to you as it is. Well, we have to learn to get in tune with God. And I also want to just echo Nirmala's reminder to listen to my heart's song, because we have to, there is a reason why God gave us, think of the ratio, the mathematical ratio here now, 1 mouth, 2 ears. There's kind of a thing there of how we listen a little bit more and we talk a little bit less, and which I could maybe do myself. But think of that when a friend and a friend are together, there's this communion. I remember reading, I think it may have been John Muir had a friend. He used to spend days and weeks and months in nature, just roaming the mountains, roaming in the snow, roaming in the seasons, whatever. But he had a friend with whom he could spend hours and hours and hours, whether at one of their homes or whether out in the wild. And they didn't need to talk at all. Their conversation could be in perfect silence. They could greet each other and spend hours together, and at the end say, we've had a wonderful visit. And think of how odd that is in a way, and how wonderful in another way. If you think of driving with someone that you don't know very well in the car, you're in the car with a cab driver or something, and you just want to be quiet, and they want to talk, and it's like, just... But, there's this potential sort of awkwardness there. But if you can be comfortably in silence and in stillness, then there can be a kind of communion that happens beyond words. Or if there are words, those words have real meaning. Those words make a connection. And that is what we need to make. God is able and willing to give us anything and everything, but we have to be ready to receive it. And that was a lesson for me in thinking about this boy, because when you're grabbing, when you're sort of saying to life, give me, without the sense of offering something, and this was sort of Swamiji's lesson also. He learned, and I think in the movie his mother gives him this advice, that everyone, he was very generous with this boy in Romania, but he didn't ever ask anything of the boy. The boy could also contribute something, could be appreciated in some kind of way, and Swami didn't know to do that. He was young at the time, and he learned a hard lesson. Well, we all have been on both sides of that equation, and we have to, in our connection with God, learn to get in tune with, and that happens by listening. That happens by deeper and deeper attunement. First in meditation, but then in daily life. Because the clouds, the sky, the wind, the birds, God forbid, even the traffic and the cell phone ringtones, they're all speaking to us. They all tell us some message of God, if we're able to listen and able to tune in. And then when we offer ourselves, it's in this way that brings that communion, that brings that connection. That beautiful little phrase in the Bhagavad Gita reading, partaking of the nectar after a sacrifice. When you come to the end of the all-day meditation, and I hope you'll all mark this on your calendar, the 23rd of December, it falls on a Saturday this year, and we're going to do a beautiful, as we do every year, we'll do a beautiful all-day meditation starting at 8 in the morning and going till 4 in the afternoon. But whether you can come to that or not, whether that's so unbelievably intimidating or whatever, by the way, you can come to only an hour of it if you want. You don't have to come to the whole thing. But by the end of that day, in this temple, there is a nectar in the air, and every breath that you take will be an inhaling, an inspiration of that nectar. That is the nectar of a sacrifice. We've sacrificed, quote, sacrificed in many ways, some hours of a day, like we would do when we go to work, except in this case we're giving it all to God. But we get freedom from that. There's a deep, deep blessing from that. You stay up all night for Shiva Ratri, there's a blessing that comes. You feel that. It's like you reach this state of stillness. And then in that moment we think, well, why can't I be like this all the time? I want to just live this way. Well, we have to get into that habit and that natural sense of self-offering. And that comes from more than habit. It comes from real devotion. We have to cultivate and awaken that devotion. But let us, especially in this week and in the season coming, offer ourselves more and more completely to God. It's not something that anyone else can force from us, but when we do it willingly, we will find God's presence ever more completely within us.